somewhere along the bayous of Louisiana, in a parish whose name no longer appears on any surviving map, there exists a recorded incident that refuses to settle into history. It does not survive because it was extraordinary in its cruelty. Violence was common enough, but because its outcome unsettled the very structure that depended on that cruelty to function. The documents that remain are incomplete, cautious, and evasive. Yet taken together, they describe a moment when punishment failed to achieve its purpose and revealed something far more dangerous than rebellion. The account begins with a plantation operating far from oversight, where authority was exercised absolutely and rarely questioned. In such places, discipline was not merely corrective, it was performative. Pain had to be visible, fear had to be witnessed. The system relied on the certainty that punishment produced obedience, and that obedience restored order. This belief was so deeply embedded that it was never tested openly. It did not need to be, until it was. A young enslaved woman entered this record, not because of her name or origin. Those details are notably absent, but because of an accusation. She was alleged to have stolen food, a charge so common it barely warranted comment. Guilt was assumed, not proven, and the decision to punish her was immediate. What distinguished this case was not the accusation, but the response. Instead of public whipping or confinement in a shed, she was subjected to a punishment designed to break not just the body, but the mind. Beneath the kennels that housed trained hunting dogs, an underground room had been constructed. Its purpose was never formally recorded. Yet its design leaves little room for speculation. It was dark, narrow, and airless, with a ceiling formed by the same floorboards the dogs paced upon. Anyone confined there would hear every movement above, feel every vibration, and breathe air thick with the presence of animals bred for pursuit and control. This was not punishment meant to end quickly. It was punishment meant to linger. The woman was placed there without ceremony. No witnesses were invited beyond those required to secure the door. Food was withheld. Water was rationed. Time was left deliberately undefined. The intention was clear. Deprivation, fear, and isolation would reduce her to submission. This was how discipline worked. It always had. But the days passed, and something unexpected occurred. When the door was finally opened, the woman did not emerge broken. She did not collapse or plead or avert her gaze. She climbed out calmly, her movements controlled, her expression unreadable. Those present noted her composure with discomfort, though none spoke of it aloud. What unsettled them more was what followed. The dogs, animals trained to respond only to their handlers, did not react as expected. Instead of barking or lunging, they grew quiet. One by one, they aligned behind her as she walked away from the kennel. Commands were shouted. Whips were cracked. The dogs ignored them all. They followed her with a focus that was neither aggressive nor fearful, but attentive. This moment lasted only seconds, yet it disrupted everything. What made this incident intolerable was not the suggestion of the supernatural, but the inversion of authority it implied. The dogs represented enforced control. They were tools of domination, symbols of consequence. Their obedience was proof that power functioned as intended. When that obedience shifted, even briefly, it exposed a flaw no one was prepared to confront. The system could survive cruelty. It could survive death. What it could not survive was evidence that punishment did not always produce submission. The woman had endured something meant to erase her will, and yet she emerged without visible surrender. Worse still, the instruments of fear responded to her, as if recognizing something the system had failed to destroy. This is where the true story begins, not underground, but in the silence that followed. Because from that moment forward, everyone involved understood that something had gone wrong, and that acknowledging it openly would threaten far more than a single plantation. It would threaten the belief that absolute control was possible at all. The difficulty with understanding what followed lies in the absence of testimony from the one person who could have explained it. The young woman never left a record of her own experience, and no one ever asked her to provide one. Her silence, whether imposed or chosen, became a void that others attempted to fill with speculation, avoidance, and revision. What survives instead are indirect observations, moments noted in margins, and behaviors that could not be reconciled with the expectations of punishment. Those who encountered her after the confinement described a change that was subtle but undeniable. She did not speak more or less than before. She did not challenge orders or withdraw from work. Yet something about her presence altered the space around her. People paused when she passed. Conversations softened or stopped. It was not fear that caused this, but uncertainty. She no longer fit the role that had been assigned to her. The system relied on predictability, and she had become unpredictable without doing anything at all. The most unsettling observations involved the dogs. They were no longer violent or erratic. If anything, they seemed calmer than before. But their calm carried direction. They positioned themselves deliberately when she was nearby, forming loose lines rather than chaotic clusters. When she stopped, they stopped. When she moved, they followed at a distance that suggested awareness rather than command. This behavior was witnessed repeatedly, by different people, under varying conditions. It was not dismissed as coincidence, but it was not acknowledged openly either. Handlers attempted to correct the animals through familiar methods. Commands were reinforced. Discipline was increased. Food was withheld to reassert dependence. None of it restored the previous dynamic. The dogs complied selectively, responding only when the young woman was absent or out of sight. When she appeared, their attention shifted immediately. They did not bare their teeth or growl. They watched her. This quiet focus disturbed observers more than aggression ever had. This created a practical problem that extended beyond discomfort. The dogs were integral to the plantation's operations, used for patrols, tracking, and intimidation. Their unreliability introduced risk. Overseers hesitated to deploy them, unsure how they would behave in moments that required absolute obedience. That hesitation spread. Orders were second-guessed. Authority began to fray, not through open defiance, but through doubt. The young woman herself remained unchanged in behavior. She did not approach the dogs intentionally. She did not gesture or speak to them. She did not claim influence or acknowledge it. This absence of action made the situation more difficult to interpret. If she had acted, she could have been punished again. Instead, she simply existed, and that existence seemed to reorganize the hierarchy around her. Private correspondence from the estate reveals increasing anxiety. Letters reference irregularities and unsettled conditions without elaboration. The language grows careful, almost superstitious, as if naming the issue might grant it permanence. Suggestions to remove the dogs or relocate the woman appear briefly, then vanish from the record. No decisive action was taken. Only delays and adjustments meant to restore normalcy without confronting its loss. What emerges from these fragments is not evidence of transformation in the supernatural sense, but evidence of endurance altering perception. The woman had survived an experience designed to erase her autonomy. In doing so, she had disrupted the narrative that defined her position. She was no longer a symbol of submission, and yet she was not a rebel. She occupied a space the system had no language for. This ambiguity proved intolerable. Systems of control depend on clear categories, obedient or disobedient, punished or corrected. She existed outside those categories, and her presence exposed their fragility. The dog's behavior was not the cause of this rupture, but its most visible symptom. They responded not to power, but to something quieter, something untrained and uncommanded. In the end, the greatest disturbance was not what the woman had endured, but what her survival suggested: that there are limits to what domination can produce, that endurance, when pushed beyond intention, does not always result in obedience, and that when authority encounters something it cannot name, it often chooses not to see it at all. To grasp how such an incident could unfold without immediate consequence, it is necessary to understand the environment that shaped it long before the confinement ever occurred. The plantation existed within a world where distance diluted accountability and routine cruelty passed for order. The surrounding parish was sparsely governed, its officials dependent on the very landowners they were meant to oversee. Law traveled slowly along the bayous, and by the time it arrived often arrived altered, softened, or ignored entirely. What mattered most was not legality, but stability, defined by uninterrupted production and visible hierarchy. The estate itself was structured to reinforce this hierarchy at every level. Buildings were arranged not for efficiency, but for observation. Living quarters, work areas, and punishment spaces were placed within sightlines that reminded everyone who watched and who was watched. Fear was not hidden, it was displayed. Discipline occurred publicly whenever possible, not to correct the individual, but to instruct the many. The absence of resistance was interpreted as consent, and consent was assumed when resistance could not be voiced. When the Baroness acquired the property, she inherited not just land and labor, but a system already accustomed to brutality. What distinguished her rule was not its cruelty, but its precision. She was deeply invested in control as an idea, not merely a practice. Disorder offended her, even when it had no measurable impact on output. She scrutinized behavior closely, noting tone, posture, and timing with equal importance to results. Compliance had to be visible, immediate, and complete. She involved herself directly in matters others might have delegated. Overseers were not given autonomy so much as responsibility without authority. They carried out her instructions, but they did not shape them. This created an atmosphere of tension, as even those accustomed to enforcing violence found themselves monitored. Mistakes were punished swiftly, and mercy was treated as a flaw rather than a virtue. The plantation became less a workplace than a stage upon which obedience was continuously performed. The presence of the dogs was central to this performance. They were not kept on the margins, as was common elsewhere, but positioned deliberately near the heart of the estate. Their kennels were visible from the yard, their barking audible across the grounds. They served as both threat and spectacle. The Baroness understood their symbolic value and reinforced it through demonstrations, commanding them in full view of workers and visitors alike. Their responsiveness was proof of her authority, a living confirmation that dominance could be trained and enforced. It was within this carefully controlled environment that the young woman came under scrutiny. She did not draw attention through defiance, but through restraint. She followed orders, but without the exaggerated urgency expected of her. She endured punishment, but without the emotional display that validated it. Her behavior unsettled the Baroness because it denied her something essential: visible confirmation of power. Submission, when it did not look like submission, felt like resistance. This perceived insolence triggered a gradual escalation. The woman was assigned tasks designed to test her limits, then punished when those limits were reached. Accusations multiplied, often without evidence. Each infraction justified a harsher response, each response reinforcing the belief that more pressure was required. What went unrecognized was that the system was no longer correcting behavior. It was fixating on it. The underground room beneath the kennels did not emerge spontaneously from anger. Its existence suggests forethought, a willingness to push beyond established forms of discipline. It represented an attempt to dominate not just the body, but the internal experience of fear. By combining isolation, darkness, hunger, and proximity to violence, it aimed to collapse the boundary between punishment and terror. This was control taken to its logical extreme. No one questioned the construction of such a space, because questioning itself was dangerous. The plantation operated on unspoken rules that discouraged scrutiny. Those who noticed irregularities learned to look away. Survival depended on understanding which details were safe to observe and which were not. The underground room became one of those forbidden details, acknowledged only through avoidance. By the time the accusation of theft arose, the conditions were already in place. The punishment was not a response to a single act, but the culmination of a pattern. The woman's confinement was framed as discipline, but it functioned as a test of endurance, of submission, of the limits of control. The Baroness did not anticipate failure because failure had never been acknowledged as possible. This context matters because it reveals the incident not as an aberration, but as the inevitable result of a system that measured power solely by its ability to dominate. When that domination failed to produce the expected outcome, the system had no mechanism to adapt. It could only react by denying, erasing, and restoring the appearance of order at any cost. What followed, the confusion, the silence, the hurried corrections, was not the breakdown of authority, but its defense. The plantation did not collapse in chaos. It closed ranks, and in doing so, it preserved the structure that made the incident possible, even as it quietly removed the evidence that it had ever been tested at all. By the fourth night, the darkness had become something more than absence. It pressed inward, thick and weighty, collapsing distance and time until the small underground room felt endless. The young woman no longer marked the hours by the arrival of water, because no water came. Her throat burned, her lips cracked, and her thoughts slowed, each one forming with effort before dissolving again. Hunger had moved past pain and into a strange clarity, sharpening her senses even as her body weakened. Every sound above her arrived magnified. The scrape of claws, the shifting weight of massive bodies, the low, restless breathing of animals that never fully slept. At some point during the night, the dogs changed. It was subtle at first. Their pacing grew synchronized, their movements less chaotic. Instead of barking at random noises, they fell silent for long stretches, as though listening. When they did vocalize, it was not the explosive noise meant to intimidate, but something lower, almost questioning. The young woman lay on the dirt floor, her cheek pressed against the cool earth, and listened back. She did not know when she began responding, only that at some point her breath began to match the rhythm above her. By morning, if morning still existed, her body no longer shivered. The cellar smelled different, less like damp wood and more like warm soil. She noticed details she had ignored before, the faint pattern in the boards overhead, the way dust fell in slow spirals when the dogs moved, the vibration that traveled through the ladder whenever one of them jumped. She felt connected to these sensations, as if they were no longer separate from her. Fear had not vanished, but it had transformed, stretched thin and reshaped into awareness. When the trapdoor finally opened, it did so without ceremony. The ladder creaked, light spilled downward, and a face appeared briefly before pulling back. No commands were given, no insults followed. A rope was lowered instead, swaying gently in the narrow space. The young woman stood on legs that trembled, but did not fail her. She took the rope, climbed slowly, and emerged into the kennel with her eyes already adjusted, blinking only once. What happened next was later described in fragments, each account incomplete, each shaped by the terror of the observer. The dogs did not lunge, they did not snarl. They stepped aside as she reached the floor, forming a corridor without instruction. Their heads lowered slightly, not in submission exactly, but in recognition. The man who had opened the cellar door froze, one hand still gripping the rope. He would later insist he could not move, that his body refused to respond even as his mind screamed at him to run. She walked past him without touching him. The dogs followed, not crowding her, but maintaining distance, matching her pace. When she exited the kennel, the yard fell silent. Workers stopped mid-task. Tools slipped from hands. The air itself seemed to pause. She did not look at anyone as she crossed the open space toward the main house, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Dirt clung to her dress, her hair hung loose, but there was no weakness in her step. Inside the house, the Baroness was still in her chambers. She had not come down that morning. Some would later claim she sensed something was wrong, that she had been awake for hours, listening for sounds that never came. Others insisted she had slept deeply, confident in her authority, certain that punishment had done its work. The truth remains uncertain. What is known is that when the bedroom door finally opened, it was not at her command. No one heard raised voices. No struggle was reported. There were no screams. Servants nearby recalled only a sudden stillness, followed by the sound of something heavy striking the floor. When they entered the room minutes later, the Baroness lay collapsed near the foot of the bed, her face slack, her eyes open but unfocused. The physician summoned from town declared heart failure, though he noted an unusual expression on her face, as though surprise had overtaken her at the very end. The young woman was gone. So were the dogs. They were seen one last time at the gates just after dawn. A neighboring planter, riding past on his way to town, described a procession that made him pull his horse to a stop. A girl walked ahead, her pace unhurried, her gaze fixed forward. Behind her came 8 massive dogs, aligned perfectly, their movements so precise they appeared trained for parade. They did not look at the road or at the man watching. Their eyes remained fixed on her back, unblinking. By midday, the estate was in disarray. Orders contradicted one another. Records went missing. The overseer locked himself in his quarters. Within days, a fire broke out in the main house, spreading quickly and consuming everything of value. Some claimed it was an accident. Others whispered that it was necessary. Ashes replaced walls, and silence replaced explanation. What could not be erased were the letters written in haste and fear, sent to relatives and associates in neighboring parishes. Each described the same image, the same impossible calm, the same unsettling obedience of creatures bred only for violence. None attempted to explain it. None could. The turning point was never officially acknowledged, but it marked the moment when control shifted irreversibly. What had been built to dominate had responsive to something deeper than command. Whatever happened in the darkness beneath the kennels did not break the young woman as intended. It altered the balance that everyone else had assumed was fixed. And once that balance shifted, the only solution left to those in power was to pretend it never had. In the weeks that followed, the parish moved quickly to settle back into something resembling normalcy. Official statements were brief and carefully worded. The death of the estate's owner was attributed to natural causes, an unfortunate but not uncommon end given the climate and her disposition. The fire that destroyed the main house was blamed on faulty lamps and careless servants. These explanations were accepted not because they were convincing, but because they were convenient. Questioning them would have required looking too closely at matters best left undisturbed. What remained of the estate was dismantled with surprising efficiency. Usable materials were salvaged and sold, the land parceled out through a series of quiet transactions. New owners arrived within a year, eager to distance themselves from the past. They rebuilt selectively, leaving certain areas untouched. The kennel foundations were filled in. The ground above the underground room was leveled and replanted. No marker indicated what had existed there before. To an outsider, it became just another stretch of productive soil. Yet the story did not vanish entirely. It lingered in margins and memories, preserved not through formal records, but through avoidance. Older residents of the parish learned which topics caused conversations to falter. Directions that once included the name of the estate were rerouted around it. Children were warned away from certain paths without being told why. Silence itself became a form of remembrance. A handful of documents survived despite deliberate efforts to eliminate them. Letters written in the immediate aftermath surfaced decades later in private collections, their authors long dead. These accounts were cautious, often vague, but consistent in their unease. They described a sense of wrongness rather than specific events, an impression that something fundamental had been disrupted. None of them named the young woman directly. None attempted to explain her disappearance. They focused instead on the dogs, on their behavior, on the unsettling calm that accompanied their departure. The overseer's journal ended abruptly that same year. The final entries became increasingly fragmented, shifting from detailed records of labor and output to short, anxious observations. He wrote of sleeplessness, of sounds he could not place, of dreams in which he stood in the yard, unable to move as something passed him by. After the plantation was sold, he left the parish entirely. He never held another position of authority. When he died years later, his obituary described him as a man of declining health, prone to isolation. The larger system that enabled the incident remained intact. Other plantations continued operating under similar conditions, governed by the same assumptions about power and control. No reforms followed. No investigations were launched. The absence of consequences reinforced the lesson already understood by those in authority. Stability mattered more than truth. What could not be integrated into the existing order had to be removed. And yet, the story endured because it resisted complete erasure. It challenged a narrative that depended on predictability, on the belief that dominance always produced obedience. The account suggested something else entirely, something far more unsettling. It implied that endurance could transform, that survival itself might reshape the dynamics of power in ways that could not be easily undone. For those who encountered the fragments years later, the story functioned less as a cautionary tale and more as a disturbance. It refused to settle into familiar categories of victim and oppressor. The young woman was not remembered as broken, nor as triumphant, but as altered. The lack of clarity surrounding her fate became central to the account. She did not escape in the traditional sense. She departed with something that had once belonged entirely to someone else. The dogs, too, remained an unresolved element. Trained for intimidation, conditioned to obey a single voice, they were not meant to follow anyone else. Their behavior undermined the assumption that control could be permanently embedded through fear alone. Whether what occurred was instinct, conditioning, or something less easily named was never determined. The uncertainty itself became the point. In the end, the incident was absorbed into the landscape as a quiet anomaly, a story told in lowered voices and incomplete sentences. It survived not because it was proven, but because it was plausible within a system that allowed such things to happen. Its power lay in what it suggested rather than what it confirmed. It reminded those who heard it that even the most rigid structures contain vulnerabilities, and that when those vulnerabilities are exposed, the response is rarely justice. More often, it is silence, ash, and the steady rebuilding of a world that insists it was never disturbed at all. Stories like this do not end cleanly. They linger, not because every detail is known, but because something about them refuses to settle into certainty. Long after the names are forgotten and the land is reshaped, the questions remain. What actually happened in that darkness? What changed, and why was it so important that no official records survive? These are the kinds of mysteries that persist not on paper, but in the spaces where explanation fails. If this account unsettled you, that reaction is part of the experience. These stories were never meant to comfort. They exist at the edge of documented history, where facts blur into something more disturbing, precisely because they cannot be fully verified or dismissed. They force us to confront how easily cruelty can be normalized, how systems protect themselves, and how the most unsettling outcomes are often the ones that leave no clear evidence behind. There are countless other accounts like this, scattered across forgotten archives, personal letters, and oral traditions. Stories that challenge what we think we know about power, obedience, and survival. Each one offers a fragment, a glimpse into moments when control fractured and something unexpected emerged in its place. Exploring them is not about proving the impossible, but about recognizing the patterns that allowed such events to occur without consequence. If you want to continue uncovering these hidden histories, there are more stories waiting. Each one reveals a different shadowed corner of the past, where official explanations fall apart and human behavior becomes far more complex than the records admit. Take a moment to share what stayed with you most from this account. Was it the silence afterward, the behavior of the dogs, or the deliberate erasure that followed? Your perspective adds another layer to the conversation. And if you're drawn to stories that exist between history and the unexplained, stay with us. There are many more to come. Each one asks you not just to listen, but to question. What survives? What disappears? And who decides which stories are allowed to be told at all?